Thank you very much for joining us. Oh, sorry, recording is in progress, guys, in case you didn't get that blasted in your ear, as I did. Thank you very much, Keith, for sitting and going. I sort of waited. I'm Sharon Constanson. I'm chairman of the membership committee, and I'm on the court of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators. Most of you know who I am, but there are a number of foreigners that are here, people who've known me from different aspects of my life. So I thought I would just make sure that everyone else did know why I'm here and what I'm talking about. In my day job, I'm doing governance, board evaluations, but I also get involved in the area of risk management. I am passionate about upping the quality of risk management in our boards, and I will hone in specifically, for example, on the FTSE 250 and the FTSE 100 and the AIM-listed companies. The degree of quality risk management is unfortunately very, very substandard, let's say that. We have our exceptions, absolutely. And if we look to the financial services sector, it is definitely a place where we could gain and benefit from some of the learnings without having to go OTT in the same way. So it is important to bring these learnings across. And in my process of risk management and integrating with the risk management community, I am involved with the Risk Coalition. The Risk Coalition has a number of very passionate individuals going from financial services sector to ordinary business who have got together and created originally a framework called Raising the Bar, which has been accepted by the regulator as being a standard for board committees and board risk committees. The reason I give you that background is in today's day and age, we all accept and understand the importance of E, S, and G, the modern agenda, making sure we look after our climate, our people, our planet before we start looking after profit. But if we don't have profit, we're not sustainable. So we need to get to that bottom point as well. And in that engagement with the Risk Coalition, they've been expanding their brief and the way they have been operating, and such is where I got to meet Derek. Derek Leatherdale and I have not met each other in person, like a number of us haven't met each other in person. And there's one person on screen here today who I met today for the first time in 2.5 years since I last saw him in person. Yet we see each other probably every week. So it's interesting how this coming back to life is changing. Derek is coming to us from a very specific angle of governance, a very specific angle of risk. And it's picking out the extra G in ESG. So ESG squared, the second G is about geopolitical risk. It's one of those things that you probably as an individual can do absolutely nothing about. But it is something that we can do something about preparing for, being mindful of, considering it in our risk register, putting it into our business process planning, and making sure that we are not taken off guard. So yes, we can be prepared, and that makes a big difference. So our guest speaker, Derek Leatherdale, is a lead instructor and course developer for DCRO, Institute in Geopolitical Risk Governance. And he provides boards, heads of risk, risk functions with practical advice to ensure their organizations can thrive in a VUCA stroke volatile world that we are in today, where we have to be agile, we have to find the answers quickly, and we have to find the right answers. So he helps them, businesses develop resilience, thrive amongst exceeding geopolitical volatility, and is the founder of HSBC's Group Geopolitical Risk Function and Associate Director of the Risk Coalition, which I've made reference to, and leading on risk thinking on corporate management of geopolitical risk. So now that we know that we can do everything possible to make sure Putin stays in his place, and we know how to control him and manage him, we're now going to get told what's that all going to do for our businesses. So Derek will chat first, and I won't interrupt him. And then we will have an in-conversation session with Derek, and then we will open it to the floor so that you can ask your specific questions as well. So Derek, if I may hand over to you, please.
Yes, by all means, and thank you, Sharon, for such a fulsome introduction. I feel under no pressure whatsoever. I hope I can deliver the goods, as it were. I just thought I would speak for about 15 minutes or so in a relatively informal way, rather than speaking to a presentation, just picking up on a number of points in order. First, I thought it might just sort of be worth briefly recounting what the situation is on the ground in the Ukraine. Not because I suspect most of your organizations have business there, and certainly if they do, I'm sure your contingency and business continuity plans have well and truly kicked in by now, but more because that really is the driver, I think, for where the international policy response will go next. And that is the thing that I think is having, if you like, more of an impact on the international business, financial and economic environment, and therefore probably the thing that's affecting your organizations more. I thought on the back of that, it might just be worth briefly recounting some of the really quite, to my mind anyway, fascinating business impacts that we've seen, including some of those businesses who've exited or closed down operations in Russia. If there's time, I'll just briefly point to some of the wider geopolitical considerations that I think the situation in Ukraine gives rise to, perhaps in respect of Russia's escalation possibilities, perhaps in respect of what this means for China and Taiwan. There won't be time to do that to any great level of detail, but we can perhaps pick up on those points more in Q&A. And then I'd just like to sort of finish my remarks by looking at some of the, if you like, the governance considerations, governance thinking that all of this generates, both perhaps in terms of what companies and what boards should be thinking that their companies should be doing now in terms of the way they're approaching consideration of the impacts of all of this, but then also in respect of some longer term thinking, and what boards can start to be doing and start to be suggesting that their organizations put in place and implement as we sort of transition into what you might describe as a kind of new era of geopolitics, not just in Eastern Europe, but globally. Okay, so just very briefly, in terms of what's happening on the ground, I think probably two or three major high-level points. The first is that if Russian generals and indeed Putin ever had any thinking that they might be able to take Kiev in 3 or 4 days, I mean, clearly that hope is sort of long gone. I think the near consensus amongst the, if you like, the analytical community in other governments is that Putin's invasion plan has gone much more slowly than expected. And even now, sort of 3 weeks in, you can see that the amount of ground that Russian forces hold, in some cases rather patchily, is actually a relatively slender proportion of Ukraine's overall territory. And the idea, for instance, that they're in a position now to take Kiev in sort of at reasonable speed is also, I think, no longer true. So all told, much slower progress by Russian forces than expected, including by analysts in other capitals. That, I think, has been accompanied by a couple of other things. Firstly, much higher Russian casualties and much stiffer opposition from Ukrainian forces, open brackets, Ukrainian forces using Western weapon systems and to some extent in receipt of prior Western military training. And I think that has implications for China's thinking on Taiwan, which we could pick up on. And across all of that, of course, fairly clear that Putin has utterly lost the international, if you like, social media and PR narrative. And all told, therefore, this is a situation that is not going according to plan from a Russian perspective. Now, I say all of that not to get sort of into the weeds of military analysis, but because I think it generates a potential risk. And we're starting to see elements of that. You can see, for instance, that Russian forces, it would appear, have loosened what Western militaries or what other militaries would call their rules of engagement around engaging targets that are in or near civilian populations. They've clearly taken to using tactics that are more likely to cause civilian casualties. And there is, I think, a risk as they try and regain the initiative in their advance of using weapon systems which they currently haven't used, that would cause quite widespread civilian casualties, particularly if used in urban areas. And that, I think, takes me to my second point, that if that were to happen, then I think the international policy response would inevitably toughen. Now, I think it's fair to characterize that response as having been tougher than many people expected anyway. I mean, for instance, it was held as a sort of something of an article of faith that no Russian financial entities would be excluded from SWIFT. That's clearly not happened, and that some have. But in terms of where the international policy response could go next, if the situation on the ground were to escalate, I think we would then see more sanctions applied to larger swathes of the Russian corporate sector. So many of the sanctions are currently fixed on state-owned enterprises in Russia, or those with a large state-owned component. And I think a further round of sanctions could certainly go beyond that to other sections of the Russian corporate sector. There are a number of oil and gas carve-outs in the current sanctions that have been in place for the last couple of weeks. I think some of those could also be taken away, and I wouldn't be surprised too if further SWIFT exclusions were to be put in place. That, I think, is, if you like, the sort of the contingency for the business sector in general to plan against. I see reporting today that, sort of, or rather suggestions in media reporting, that there may be increased prospects for a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Happy to pick up more on what that sort of state of affairs and how stable that might be in the medium term in questions. But we've sort of, to some extent, been here before, and I think from a business point of view, I wouldn't bank on that sort of kicking in soon. Although it's very hard. This is clearly a fast-moving situation. I also see it reported today that just on that point about indiscriminate weapons use, that the US National Security Advisor had a telephone call this morning with his opposite number in the Russian national security system, and they publicly, or the US National Security Advisor said publicly afterwards that he had warned his Russian opposite number against the use of chemical and biological weapons. And it's that kind of escalation scenario that I think is sort of there in the background, that were any of that to happen would inevitably drive a more robust international policy response. Okay, so I wanted to touch next on the corporate impacts. You, I'm sure, will all have seen some of the media coverage of this, the very wide range of companies who've exited their operations in Russia. And I think that sort of gives rise to a fascinating range of governance questions, which I'll touch, or at least start unpicking in a couple of minutes. But I think the sort of 2 or 3 key points on the international corporate response that I think are worth highlighting here and bearing in mind as we start thinking about the governance dynamics, if you like, and the governance implications of what's happened. One is, I think many companies have gone quite substantially beyond in their corporate response the minimum that the legal minimum that sanctions require. Now, there can be a mixture of reasons for that, some altruistic and perhaps some driven, frankly, by operational or financial necessity. But certainly, I think there's been more corporate response to this than pretty much any other geopolitical event than I can remember. And that's been very interesting to see. But perhaps the other thing, and if you stand back from the situation or from some of those reports of sort of specific corporations and companies either withdrawing or closing operations in Russia, I think one of the other things all of this shows is how, if you like, a regional geopolitical event can cascade and generate second and third order consequences for the wider global economy in a way that I don't think has happened for decades. And that, I think, sort of starts to speak to the nature of the role of governance in ensuring companies get a better handle on the kinds of impacts that disruptive geopolitical events can create. And what do I mean by that? I mean, for instance, you can see how sharp rises in oil and gas prices are triggering macroeconomic consequences in markets hundreds and thousands of miles away from Ukraine. You can see how the fact that bread or wheat can no longer be exported from Odessa is having a series of second and third order consequences for food prices across the world. You can see, because of Russia's position as a major exporter of some sensitive and sort of industrially important raw materials and commodities, again, in a global market where those flows are disrupted or cut, how that can cascade out and affect businesses in many other parts of the world. And I think that's sort of one of the key points I wanted to get across in my remarks, that, you know, it's easy to think of this as being something that just affects business in Ukraine or in Russia. But actually, when you stand back a bit, you can start to see some of the much more wide-ranging consequences. And it's sort of trying to understand those consequences that I think is part of the governance challenge for international business in, as I say, what you could describe as this kind of new era of geopolitics. Just before touching on some more detailed thoughts on the governance dimensions of this, I thought it might just be worth pointing to a couple of other geopolitical sort of ramifications and implications for other parts of the world. I mentioned the idea that you know, Russia has options to escalate the way it's conducting its military operations in Ukraine. I don't think there's any sort of realistic either prospect or appetite amongst NATO governments to respond with or via military means in that kind of escalation scenario. I know where I've talked about this with other people, they often ask the question, you know, will NATO governments respond with military force? Would they, for instance, respond to a major Russian cyber attack with military force? Would that be enough to trigger the Article 5 threshold for NATO member states? I think the short answer to all of that is generally no. The kind of, if you like, the appetite, the risk appetite amongst NATO governments, let alone having the right military resources in place in Eastern Europe to do something like that, is very low indeed. I thought just two other sort of key points. There's quite a lot of commentary around Putin's domestic position and whether what he's initiated here is sort of net positive or net negative for his own regime stability prospects. You will recall that certainly in the first few days of the or after the invasion, there were a number of quite well attended protests in major Russian cities against the war. I think to some extent that's tailed off, probably in part because of the security force response, rather than because there's been a sort of a galvanizing of opinion for Putin's position. I don't think, therefore, there is an immediate threat to his domestic position, but I think it's probably fair to say the ultimate object of the international policy response is, if you like, to try and make sure that, if I could put it in this, using this way of putting it, that Putin has sort of created a situation, a trap, sort of to some extent of his own making, and the ultimate object of international policy should now be to make sure he falls into it, particularly bearing in mind quite how slowly and quite how contrary to expectation that the military plan is going. By the way, in all of this, there is, I think, a question about Belarus's position. It's probably a minority sort of question, but just in case, if anyone's under any impression that Belarus is somehow seen as a distinct and separate and to some extent less culpable party in all of this, and that therefore it's okay to continue doing business there, I would caution strongly against that as a sort of general point for a mixture of reasons, and happy to pick up on that in Q&A if people wish. And then lastly, people often link this to China and the possibility of Chinese action against Taiwan. Could I sort of summarize, I think, where we're at with that by saying the following. Had Putin taken Kiev in 3 or 4 days, had the sort of international PR picture been rather less critical of him and Russia generally, had the international policy response been rather more fragmented and less robust, then perhaps with the sum of all of those things, strategic thinkers in Beijing might have thought that actually any thinking in respect of Taiwan could be accelerated. I think, in fact, if anything, it's been precisely the opposite. The strength of the, if you like, or at least the degree of coordination and robustness of the international policy response, the fact that the Ukrainian military response, and as I mentioned earlier, is driven heavily by military equipment from other countries and by military training from other countries, both of which are common to Taiwan's defense posture, and the fact that clearly the military operation has not progressed in the way that Russia had hoped, despite a great deal of investment in their military over the last 15 years or so. I think all adds up to probably giving China a bit of pause for thought on Taiwan, and happy to unpick that a bit more in Q&A as well. Let me just finish with a couple of thoughts on the, if you like, what those in governance positions can be looking for and perhaps prompting in their organizations. I think the first is that, bearing in mind the very wide-ranging nature, the sort of the financial markets, the macroeconomic, the supply chain disruption, the sort of potential cyber elements of the corporate impacts that have been generated by this, and bearing in mind that many of those impacts are being felt in markets, not physically contiguous to Ukraine or Russia. I think one thing that those in governance positions could be looking to either suggest or facilitate in their organizations is some sort of short-term mechanism to make sure that all affected bits of an organization are coming together and working in a kind of cross-functional working group type work stream to make sure that impacts are properly understood, and to make sure that any, if you like, sort of reactive mitigation can be worked through on a holistic basis. And really the geopolitics as a general sort of discipline in the corporate sector is one that involves making sure different bits of an organization work together. And typically the larger an organization or the more complex its internal structures, the harder that can be to achieve. So if you're sort of in a governance position now, if you like, and thinking, well, what should I be doing now? Well, one thing could be to check, is there a kind of cross-functional working group structure looking at how this impacts your organization across all relevant elements, and how is it operating? And there may be things that you can then do to facilitate that. And then the final sort of point I wanted to make was much more about the longer term governance elements to all of this. And as Sharon mentioned in the introduction, I've just authored with the Risk Coalition guidance for boards and their risk committees on approaches, if you like, to geopolitical issues, and how they can more effectively ensure that their organizations are addressing these in a sort of properly strategic, properly holistic, and properly sort of anticipatory way, rather than waiting for things to happen and then trying to react, which inevitably generates problems. And I think one of the reasons that I say that is because if you look at nearly all of the business exits from Russia, they nearly all involve those firms who've taken those decisions taking big losses. So, for instance, BP said that their decision to exit their JV with Rosneft, potentially entails a $25 billion loss. BlackRock's exit from Russian financial markets entails a $17 billion loss. Now, of course, you can say that those losses in the context of their overall balance sheets, and in BP's case, in the context of sharp rises in the oil price, may be bearable. But nevertheless, I think that the governance challenge here is perhaps to get in place the kind of arrangements that could anticipate these kinds of shocks and these kinds of issues more effectively, so that those losses wouldn't be as great. And to give you an interesting sort of, if you like, anecdotal observation on the governance challenge, BP set up in 2020 a geopolitical advisory council to its group board. And it remains unclear to me the extent to which that council was providing advice to the board in the run-up to the Russian invasion, particularly bearing in mind quite how well advertised from in particular the US and the UK those warnings were about Russian military intentions. But nevertheless, the fact that BP has a geopolitical advisory council is something that, for instance, we cite as an example of good corporate governance practice for boards of organizations operating across a more geopolitically volatile world. So I think the longer term sort of governance challenge here is around trying to make sure the organization above which a board sits has the right kind of capabilities within it to anticipate these kinds of challenges, not just in respect of Russia and Ukraine, but in other parts of the world, but also then is able to link that to systematic and interconnected impact analysis within the organization as a driver of effective mitigation. There's also a piece, I think, on this around taking opportunities, commercial opportunities that geopolitics can give rise to. There's also a governance piece too around external stakeholder management. So where investors or other external stakeholders like regulators are increasingly concerned about an organization's, if you like, geopolitical exposures, and how boards and their risk oversight committees can use either existing resources more effectively or seek to recalibrate the way they manage those external stakeholder relationships. And then there's probably a final point too on that around, as Sharon mentioned at the beginning, what do we mean by ESG, and is geopolitics now a sort of a driver of ESG decision making? And I think the governance, if you like, opportunity there is to make sure that geopolitical concerns and ESG decision making are perhaps more closely aligned and integrated than people may have appreciated before. Let me stop there because I've rattled on for a little bit longer than expected, but we'll therefore hand back over to Sharon.
Thanks, Derek. I've been writing lots of questions because there are areas that you've touched on which could be extremely interesting to get another dimension on. One of the things I'd like to just look at first, if I may, you talked about the global cohesiveness and listed a number of things. Had they not been done this way, had they gone differently, different outcomes, how the world could be in a different place. What do you think existed in our global psyche, in the political leadership of the First World and related world to Ukraine, that actually this degree of cohesive outcome has occurred? What has gone right, or what has fortuitously landed up together working?
Well, to give a concrete example, I think, of what has gone right, in response, I mean, albeit reactive and in response to probably the most disruptive geopolitical event for several decades, is, for instance, the German government's change in policy. And that weekend in late February, where Chancellor Scholz announced essentially a kind of complete reversal of some key articles of faith around Germany's foreign policy, security policy, and general geostrategy in a way that just sort of hadn't happened. And that included, I think, for instance, that included a decision to, he couldn't really turn off Nord Stream 2 because it hadn't started pumping, but to sort of stop Nord Stream 2 in its tracks. That included, of course, commitments on defense expenditure in a way that run, if you like, deeply against the post Second World War consensus in Germany. And of course included agreeing to things like cutting some key Russian banks out of SWIFT. Not all of them by any means, but I think the general analytical consensus amongst, if you like, the kind of foreign policy analysis community beforehand was that Germany would be strongly against any SWIFT exclusions. So I think in a way, Germany is quite a good example of what's gone right, albeit after the fact. You could probably argue, as future either international relations theorists and historians will do, if only they'd done some of this a little bit beforehand, then maybe it would have given Putin pause for thought. But they got there eventually. I think one of the other things too, Sharon, is that because sort of generally speaking, European governments and the US government, whilst they were clearly aware of what the Russian military buildup was a portent of, it was sort of so incredible that they hadn't quite worked out that what this would actually entail in practice and how to respond. And I think such was the kind of psychological shock of seeing Russian troops actually invade a sovereign country in a way that hasn't been the case on the European landmass for since the middle of the last century. I think it was probably a fairly galvanizing moment, and I think that explains a lot too. I mean, for what it's worth, I think both London and Washington were probably more. They were certainly supplied and have capacity to source more intelligence, and there was a degree of skepticism in European capitals about the pre-invasion intelligence that the US in particular and the UK to some extent were in possession of. But once the facts on the ground started speaking for themselves, I think that as I say, sort of galvanized action.
One of the things we talk about in board behavior is the collective response of the average potentially becoming the collective response of the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
We also, if we look at humans, and because of our biases and us not being able to foresee or address the unknown, we assume it's not going to happen in our lifetime, in our box, in our watch, while we're in control. We literally put on the blind spots, we put the blinkers on, we close our eyes, we put our heads in the sand. We as humans don't want to see it.
Yeah.
And I look at some of the boards I work with who do that in other things in the ESG space or around their human capital or around, we've seen some of the cases like Volkswagen and Ford where they've done it around product. We're not going to do what is the right thing and react straight away. We're going to hope it's going to go away first. If it doesn't go away, then maybe we'll be forced to do something. But you begin to wonder how many things actually do go away that we still try doing it. So obviously some must go away. You were talking about a matrix response within an organization, so the different aspects. And I remember talking to Inmarsat with this group right at the beginning. We spoke to them in the July of COVID, the first COVID, so 4 months into COVID. And they had been on the ground with intelligence and knowledge back to the previous October. So they were 6 months ahead of the world, being a global communications company. So they had that, the pre-event intelligence, as you were talking about a moment ago. And they actually responded to that in a very proactive manner, and how that stood them instead for a long period of time. And the part that you talked about, the pre-event intelligence, to what extent does the world not trust that because of the Middle East wars that we had in the past? Saddam Hussein, are we putting the bias on it? Is this another one of the same things? Is that why we think we took so long to react? Respond, hopefully.
Yeah,
react.
I think partly that. So I think that, I mean, in your earlier remark, there's a human bias thing here. There's a sort of, I think, an inclination to take a head in the sand approach sometimes amongst boards, because it's quite a difficult set of issues to get your arms around, if you like. And unless you really have to, it's easier just to sort of try and gently ignore it. And I think perhaps, 15 or 20 years ago, you could argue that was probably justifiable given the global geopolitical context. I think we're now into an era where perhaps it's not. There is, I think, a fascinating question. There are intelligence academics who will no doubt be asking, how did, say, for instance, the US intelligence machinery miscalculate so badly how quickly Kabul would fall only last year, and yet seem to call the Russian invasion, not just the fact that it was going to happen, but identify the timing quite so accurately. And that is, of course, layered, as you say, Sharon, on the back of those, some of the intelligence issues around particularly Iraq, and then some of the intelligence issues around the war on terror more broadly. I mean, I think here, and where the challenge this generates for companies, I think it sort of rather reinforces an existing challenge. There are, around a board table, and indeed amongst senior management teams and corporate planning teams, lots of people have lots of views on what's going on politically or geopolitically. There are lots of, if you like, armchair analysts who come into work in the morning and say, look, I read the Financial Times and it said this, or, the Wall Street Journal's leading on that, or I read this article in The Economist, or no, he'll never do that, that politician, because that just doesn't make sense. And you get sort of hundreds of different views. I think part of the challenge, particularly for larger firms, is that they have to sort of somehow have a mechanism for trying to bring together a slightly more expert reading of what is a complex and increasingly complex geopolitical environment. And without that, you can't really cut through some of that internal, if you like, either positivity or negativity bias that organizations can suffer from, and some of the amateur and informal views that can often drive
that make a lot of noise.
Yeah, exactly. So for instance, had more companies had, I think, if you like, some sort of internal capacity to judge these things more expertly, they might well have realized that actually where governments were warning that there was a serious intelligence basis for their warnings of Russian military intentions, they should be taken more seriously. And by the way, a more expert capacity would also say, look, it's so much easier in intelligence terms to judge what an army is doing than to try and judge, for instance, whether a country's got WMD or whether a capital is about to collapse. It's just so an intelligence professional would be able to say, okay, you can actually count the number of tanks, you can intercept the comms between military units, you can spot these days with some amazingly accessible open source tools, things like first aid equipment being delivered, things like blood plasma being delivered to frontline combat units with a very short shelf life, which is a key risk indicator that something's about to happen. So there's a sort of there's kind of an expertise gap, I think, for many businesses. Geopolitics is not the kind of thing they put on a business school syllabus, and I think that's a gap. In this world, I think that's a gap, and that's part of the reason we produced the guidance, because we wanted to give firms a sort of framework within which they could say, okay, well, you probably need some more expert analytical capability, but then you need to wire it into your organization more effectively to drive the kind of impact analysis and decision making that the context increasingly requires.
Two questions I'm going to roll sort of almost together. For example, I have a stationery company that imports paper from somewhere in the world. I've got a agricultural entity that is selling farmed products to Russia, and I need to buy oil from Russia. Now, if I want to buy oil from Russia, or I am buying oil from Russia, I have a very direct, immediate a set of decisions I need to take.
Yep.
As a fruit exporter, food exporter, grain exporter, I might say it's the wrong humanitarian thing to do to withdraw my product, because then they can't feed the people. But equally ethically, I can't support the country to be able to do what it's doing. And then you've got the other one where you say, I have a need to rely on a resource that you are giving me. And am I going to do like we've done in the pandemic, very quickly, very agile, change and bring my green energy agenda onto the forefront and put it on steroids?
Yeah.
And we're going to have a green energy solution 10 years earlier than we could have done. These are all the things that cross my mind as to the kind of variation complexities. That small company, that stationary company, they will probably look at it and say, I don't need to worry. But I'd like you to tell me why they should potentially worry, and how should the other two types of examples worry.
So the stationary company, if they're exporting to Russia, I take it that's the
let's say no, they've got nothing to do with Russia whatsoever.
Okay,
so happen to be a stationary company selling in the UK, middle of the UK. They're stuck in the Midlands. They make paper. They sell paper, and they don't even have an import industry.
Okay,
I'm insular, so why must I worry?
So it would depend, I think, to the extent to which they rely on purchasing, if you like, their raw materials on international markets, and the prices of those raw materials, which are clearly driven by global influences rather than simply
and it might be 2 steps away from them.
Very
they're
much,
sourcing locally, but it's their supply chain that is being impacted both ways, in my view.
Exactly that. And then, of course, they, presumably will have some kind of growth strategy or corporate strategy for their business in the UK, which may well take account, for instance, of the amount of disposable income that consumers have. And in a context in which disposable incomes are being squeezed by a number of pressures, not least of which, the rise in the amount it costs to fill the tank of petrol. I'm too
scared to go fill my tank.
Yeah, exactly. Try filling a diesel Volvo. It's eye-watering. But you can see pressures, if you like, on the demand side and the supply side. Now, look, probably in the stationary company's case, I think one other vector here would be around probably wouldn't be around cyber vulnerability, but there would be other firms, who may think that they're sort of somehow domestically insulated or insulated by dint of their domestic locus, who actually could well be subject to, for instance, hostile state-sponsored cyber attacks. So I think that would be another issue. I mean, I don't imagine that the sort of quasi-state cyber organizations in Russia would particularly single out a stationary company, but they would certainly look to target and probe the cyber defenses of, for instance, critical national infrastructure sectors and companies operating in that, even if those sectors have got absolutely nothing to do with Russia.
Warning.
In that sense,
very interesting warning, that one that you're just giving us.
And then as for the other examples, so I think agriculture generally, so you can see a number of second and third order impacts. For instance, you may have clocked that the price of fertilizer has spiked, partly because Ukraine and I think Belarus are major exporters of one of the key elements of agricultural fertilizer, potash, and those exports have been very severely disrupted. Likewise, agricultural firms will quite often quite dependent on the price of, for instance, diesel and other energy intensive inputs. And so the prices of those are going up. So you can start to see, I think, for the exporter, for the company exporting to Russia, I think the really key thing is you may well want to continue exporting, but how on earth are you going to get your the importer at the other end to pay you, because effectively a large swathe of the banking system and the financial connectivity to Russia has been shut down.
Just going back to that agricultural company, somebody I know, and I'd like you to answer the last one in a second, and I'm going to open it to the floor. The situation where a particular organization I know had a major problem with their crop because of weather.
Yeah.
Insects and all sorts of other things, but this particular season, it was the weather. It destroyed some of the product. They then can't ship it around the world because we've ended up with our ships and everything all doing the wrong thing because of the pandemic. And now they've worked out that they've got 20% of their delivery of the product they've got actually goes to Russia. And you think, there's perfect storms, but my God, is that a perfect typhoon?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so difficult for a company to predict that.
Yeah, so I think so in the case of the shipping point, I don't know if you've got, but a large number of international shipping companies, for instance, Maersk, have essentially said we're no longer shipping to Russia. I think it would have been possible to anticipate that, if not the magnitude of the impact, the possibility that should Russia invade, that would lead to an international policy response that might hamper, for instance, one's ability to export to what sounds like a major export market for the firm in question. 20%, so 1/5 of their export portfolio.
So you've got your bottom line hit 3 times over.
Yeah.
Things probably weren't even on the risk register.
Well, exactly. And I would argue in the case of Russia and Ukraine that we've had kind of 3 months warning. So this is one of the most well advertised geopolitical shocks I think there has been. I mean, Washington and London and other European capitals somewhat later have been saying, look, there's a real risk here. So I think, anticipating this and trying to think through some of the immediate consequences and then how that might impact firms would have been possible under some sensible contingency planning. I think it is fair to say, Sharon, that you can't anticipate everything, and that there is a degree of complexity that is probably hard to get at, and that, if you like, any modelling around impacts, particularly say the financial impacts, is likely to be imperfect because it's impossible to model the future perfectly. But I'm always reminded with these kinds of questions, Sharon, of Eisenhower's saying, and from a military context, he would say, or he did say, plans are useless, but planning is essential. And having the processes that run in the background, and I think this is where this sort of tracks into the governance, if you like, requirement. Are there processes to undertake this kind of planning, even if you're aiming sort of at slightly the wrong kind of contingency target?
We can do all the planning, but that event will not be the event you thought it was going to be.
Yeah, but you've probably then built, say, financial resilience as a consequence of the planning that would stand you in good stead. And, I think the analogy with, say, COVID is really interesting. Probably one of the reasons the global financial sector withstood the introduction of lockdowns and those kind of vertiginous falls in GDP. And you'll know, Sharon, how that tracks into, for instance, credit risk models, and puts banks' balance sheets under a great deal of stress, because suddenly your quantum of credit risk has just, purely by dint of that GDP drop, has risen very substantially. The fact that banks were able to withstand that, I think, tracks back to the fact that they all now have to do stress testing in a way that they didn't have to do 15 years ago. They all now hold more capital. And so I think there's a degree of kind of resilience there. But they didn't do those stress tests because of a COVID pandemic scenario. But it nevertheless stood them in good stead.
For good governance. Shall we see if there's any questions from the floor? I've got plenty to keep you out of mischief until the hour, but maybe there's somebody else who's got a better question. Any hands up? Excellent, David. Then Rose.
I'm not sure this is a better question, but it's a different question, and it's certainly relevant. I work for an international body which has almost 1,000 universities in membership, and 17 of them are Russian. And Right. This is a question about information. Which information can be relied on, and also a question about what happens afterwards. A body called the Rectors Union of Russia, 600 odd universities, have put out a statement claiming that Russian universities support Putin in the war, right? One of the responsibilities of that body is to ensure that universities in Russia can operate with academic freedom. 15,000 academics in Russia have signed a letter condemning the war, which has been pulled down from the internet, right? We also have universities in Ukraine, which are in membership, and I've got to make a response on behalf of our organisation to how we deal with this. They have put out today, the Russians have put out today a video of students of one university supporting the war. One of the guys in the front of it looks remarkably like Hitler, but I'm sure that's an accident rather than anything. So my question really obviously ferret around try and get good information that we can depend on, but the state is clearly controlling the information that is going to universities. We know that instructions have been given to schools as to what is to be taught, and it's certainly not to be referred to as a war and so on. So question one is about information in these situations and what information can be relied on. Question two is hopefully this is not going to happen forever. Higher education is a remarkably international business which operates sometimes across hostilities and so on. It's difficult to see a way of Russia getting back into this now, having done this, but that may be a blinkered view based on a few days' experience of the war. I'd very much value your reaction to those situations.
Yeah, if I could take the second of those first, David, I think there is a very interesting potential decision point at some point in the future for many international organizations about when they might re-engage in the Russian market. If I could kind of use that as a piece of shorthand, what would the conditions need to be before, and I look at this particularly from a corporate perspective, before companies would re-enter the Russian market, or for instance, reopen their manufacturing or their commercial operations in Russia, having made a decision under pressure to withdraw at speed. I can't speak for the specifics of the higher education sector, and I'd need to understand a bit more about your decision requirements and decision points to inform you on the information sources question. But in respect of that re-entry conundrum, if, for instance, there were a ceasefire in Ukraine tomorrow, but Putin remained in power, from a corporate perspective, if you wanted them to go back into the Russian market, you may find yourself, for instance, dealing with Russian state-owned entities, on the boards of which, or if not on the boards directly, the boards have connections to a series of indicted international war criminals, in the Russian state. I mean, in those circumstances, I think the kind of both the appetite for re-entry is going to be quite low, particularly now that I guess businesses have bitten the losses, they've accepted them, they've swallowed them, and also that the threshold for re-engaging would be quite high. Different firms will calibrate those kind of thresholds, at different levels, but I suspect the overwhelming view will be one of some reluctance to re-engage. Ukraine, a different issue. If there were a ceasefire tomorrow, I think there would be some substantial and quite quick re-engagement by overseas organizations. And then I think all of the above, to some extent, hinges on whether Putin remains in place. And if
have
there were,
Rose's, sorry,
if there
carry
were
on.
an overthrow, sorry, Sharon, then we might then be in a slightly different constellation of issues, depending who or what replaces him.
Mhm. Maybe we
Sorry,
can get
that's
Rose's question quickly, because I know you have a hard stop.
oh yes.
We are
Thank
there.
you. Thank you. My question is probably a little bit simplistic, maybe, but I was interested in your comments on the companies engaging external analysts, intelligence analysts. Do companies in general, sorry, the intelligence specialists, do they have access to data or information that you wouldn't find then in the usual press or specialist papers? I'm just interested in the concept.
Yeah, so there is a kind of an arena, if you like, or an orbit of political risk consultancies, some better than others, some bringing, if you like, genuine expertise, some, I think, just essentially aggregating media sources and putting sort of something of a gloss on those. So there's a bit of an art to knowing on whatever issue that you're confronted by, what sources of information you might look for from that quarter. For bigger organizations, there are, so governments generally are open to talking about some of these issues. So a lot of the work I did at HSBC tried to leverage connections, more effective and systematic connections to the British government and the relevant bits of the British government, and also to try and harness their links to other governments with, if you like, access to robust independent data and analysis. So it is possible to try and tap into that as well. I mean, I find, Rose, that quite often in a corporate environment, many individual teams, whether they're in a risk function, whether they're in a strategy function, whether it might, and sometimes even first line management and sort of CEOs, will be potentially accessing views and input from either specialists, independent specialists, or political risk consultancies. So the challenge there is not that companies aren't sort of pulling in this kind of perspective and insight. It's that different parts of the organization are pulling in different bits of insight. And when you look at it in the round, none of it sort of adds up to a properly coherent internal picture. And part, I think, of the trick for international firms on this is to say, if you like, what is our version? Or, you know, what is the version of our analysis that drives all of the action that's relevant on this issue, rather than having 10 different sort of analytical viewpoints driven by 10 different external consultancies. You know, how do you bring together a more coherent internal view? And that can be partly a case of saying, okay, rather than having 10 different external consultancies spending, I don't know, $500,000 a year or whatever it is on these different sources of input, why don't we bring some more coherence to this and maybe even spend a bit less, but at least then work to a single view of what the geopolitical context is and how it might evolve.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Derek, in your interests, it is 3 minutes past 7.
You're quite right. I'm on a hard stop at 7, otherwise my wife will kill me.
You will get into trouble, and we don't want to
Yeah.
witness it.
Yeah.
I would like the team to give you the standard measure of livery thank you. So appreciate what you've done for us, the
My pleasure.
insights that we have had. We don't have the answers, and I think that's the part you made very clear to us. But if we can plan for the unknown, when it comes, we can deal with it better than if we'd been ignorant. And I think that's the difference between certain bigger companies and the way they've handled it. So thank you very, very much. It was, for me, extremely insightful. I sat there with 10,000 questions that I left out the middle, and I sort of went through a few at the beginning, jumped to one at the end because I looked at the time. I thought, I can't believe we've been talking for an hour. It's embarrassing, but very, 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 very informative. And thank you very much. We've had a really mixed crowd here today, and I thank you all for coming as well, from a past master to other court members as well, and our clerk. Thank you very much for joining us. And Derek, thank you. You're welcome to drop off. Say a final word as suits you.
And Sharon, let me just say, if anyone wants, has got other questions, very open to discussions offline if people wish. and as sort of time permits, but very happy to pick up further conversations as people want.
Yeah. Anybody wants it, if you can't find him, ask me, or maybe when you've gone off, I can drop your details into the chat.
Okay, terrific. All right, thanks very much, everyone. Been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Bye.
Yeah.